everybody. Welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm Beth Pilgreen, your host, and today we'll be exploring the concept of emotional intelligence. Whether you call it EI or EQ for emotional quotient, it's definitely having a moment. In fact, many see this relatively recently popularized capability as the latest must-have for leadership candidates. As a certified executive coach and authorized practitioner of emotional intelligence tools and assessments, Sarah Scala certainly knows what it's all about. She is the founder and principal consultant of Sarah Scala Consulting. She's also taught emotional intelligence for Harvard University, and today she'll be joining us to talk about emotional intelligence and how we can encourage its growth within our leadership as well as within our teams. Sarah, it's so great to have you with us today.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here.
So in the introduction, I mentioned that emotional intelligence is a recently popularized term. Can you give us a little background on what it is and how it's become such an important topic?
That's a great question. So emotional intelligence is defined as our ability to recognize and understand emotions in ourselves and in others, and to use this awareness to manage our behaviors and build positive relationships. The interesting thing, Beth, is that emotional intelligence has been used in business and as a pretty common term since Daniel Goleman wrote his book on emotional intelligence back in 1995. And
Wow.
this popularized emotional intelligence in the business world.
How does EQ different from IQ?
So when we look at IQ, that measures verbal processing, logistical reasoning abilities, mathematical problem solving, and working memory. So Daniel Goleman's research showed that IQ accounts for only 20% of a person's success in life. And since he published that research back in 95, a growing body of evidence has confirmed this hypothesis. So emotional intelligence is twice as predictive of performance as IQ. Social and emotional learning enables and improves cognitive learning, which is the IQ piece of it. And this isn't an either or situation. It's recognized that these two types of intelligence really need to work together.
Right. That is so interesting, the 20% statistic that you just said. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of debate over whether or not EI or EQ is a soft skill, just a nice thing to have, or whether it's a legitimately critical competency for companies to encourage within their workforce, hence the title of this episode. My question is, can't it be both?
Well, when I thought about this question, Beth, the first thing that came to my mind was that emotional intelligence is definitely not a nice to have, as it has proven bottom line impacts on leader and team effectiveness, in addition to employee retention and performance. And this has actually been measured since 1995. So 25 years of research and learning about emotional intelligence.
Okay, in a recent blog, you wrote about the 4 components of emotional intelligence. Can you share those with us?
Happy to do that. So when we look at emotional intelligence, these are both personal and social competencies. And the 4 parts that you're referencing, take a look at Goleman's model, where he looks at self-awareness, which is our ability to accurately perceive our own emotions in the moment and understand our tendencies across different situations. Self-management is our ability to use this awareness to stay flexible and direct the behavior positively, so managing our emotional reactions. Then when we take a look at social competencies, our social awareness is our ability to accurately pick up on the emotion in other people and understand what's really going on with them. And relationship management is our ability to use this awareness of our own emotions and those of others to manage these interactions successfully.
Wow. I love how EI addresses our inner EI as well as the way we relate to people in situations outside of ourselves. Does demonstrating EI in one area mean we have a greater chance of demonstrating it in another? Or is this more of a left brain, right brain thing where you generally either favor one or the other?
So this doesn't mean that we have a greater chance of demonstrating it in other areas, as they point out and measure different skills and competencies, especially
Okay.
in regard to the personal versus the social. So our self versus others.
So now that we understand what EI or EQ is, let's talk about how it comes into play in our work environments. What are the benefits of having an emotionally intelligent workforce?
So, emotional intelligence is critical for success. It actually
Mhm.
accounts for 58% of performance in all types of jobs, and it's the
Wow.
single biggest predictor of performance in the workplace. In addition, having a leader that has a high level of emotional intelligence leads to an increased retention of members of their team.
Wow. Yeah, I've also seen the benefits of EI specifically relating to leaders. Why is EI so critical to leadership in particular? Could you expand on that?
Looking at the research, 90% of high performers also have a high level of emotional intelligence. And people with high emotional intelligence, on average, earn more per year. When
Huh.
we look at an article from Annie McKee in Harvard Business Review, 2014, she said people who understand and manage their own and others' emotions make better leaders. They're able to deal with stress, overcome obstacles, inspire others to work towards collective goals, and they manage conflict with less fallout and build stronger teams. And they are generally happier to work or happier at work. They're also noted to have better decision making and problem solving. They're cool under pressure, greater empathy, and better at, again, resolving those conflicts that come up in the workplace. Those with low emotional intelligence typically have more of a victim mentality, show more sign of passive aggression. They
Mm.
often lack teamwork, and they're more critical of other people. So when we look at team effectiveness in the workplace and the leader's role in that, emotional intelligence has a pretty clear tie to a
Yeah.
leader's ability to be effective.
Wow. When you lay it out like that, it sure sounds like companies stand to gain a lot by investing in an emotionally intelligent workforce. Sarah, we're going to take a sponsorship break right now, but when we get back, we'll talk about the different ways in which we can measure and improve EI within our own workforces. So stick with us. We'll get back to these tips in just a moment. But right now, let's talk about you. Because when your company is going through any kind of crisis, you need to know that your leaders are in alignment. So check out abetterleader.com to deliver fresh and powerful new leadership topics every month. Just minutes to get started and to start supporting your company's engagement goals. Again, you'll find that at abetterleader.com. We are back with Sarah Scala, the founder and principal consultant for Sarah Scala Consulting. Sarah, our audience, as you know, is primarily made up of HR and LR professionals, many of whom are probably right this moment wondering whether or not their workforce could be considered to be emotionally intelligent. How can they begin to gauge where their organization is right now with regards to EI?
So there are several different assessments that measure emotional intelligence if people are looking for qualitative data. And the three tools that I use with my clients are a little bit different, but they're, again, all measuring emotional intelligence. The first is the Myers-Solovay-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test. Is an actual test that a person can go through online that actually puts a qualitative measurement on their level of emotional intelligence. And it's the only one of the assessments that I'm familiar with that is an actual test of it. A lot of the research that Daniel Goleman used in his book on emotional intelligence came from the research of Myers-Solovay and Caruso historically. The next tool that I use is the Emotional Quotient Inventory, or the EQI 2.0. This is a nice assessment because I can do this either as a self-assessment, but they also have a 360 assessment. So if a leader wants to know what their team's perception of their leadership is in regard to EQ, this is a great tool for that. It provides scientifically validated data and is pretty widely used by organizations across the world. The accumulated research on the EQI 2.0 has shown that what was once considered that intangible determinant of success can now really be accurately measured. And the third tool that I use, depending again on the client, is the Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book, which includes an online assessment. So when clients buy the book, which we use in workshops that I provide, they also have the ability to take the Emotional Intelligence assessment twice, once before we start learning, and then once a month or two after when they've had some chance to practice in terms of strengthening these competencies.
Yeah, I was looking at these tests on your website and they look like something, I mean, I would love to do all of them myself. And I think that's so cool that you guys offer the 360 tool for leaders. I mean, that would be so beneficial, I think, to be able to provide that kind of feedback for our superiors. Okay, you just mentioned how EI is something that we can improve upon. Can you elaborate on this?
Happy to. So emotional intelligence can be strengthened as opposed to IQ or emotional quotient, which we pretty much are at the level that we are for most of our life. Simple ways to build emotional intelligence can be found either in the book EQ 2.0, in the book Emotional Intelligence by Dan Goleman, or through assessments with coaching. So with clients, I typically will have them as a part of their executive development. I may do one of these emotional intelligence assessments, and we build that into their coaching process. So for leaders, I often recommend the Emotional Intelligent Manager book by Caruso and Solovey, and they're the founders of the Mesquite. But for individual contributors or those who are just curious about ways to build EQ, I recommend EQ 2.0 or Dan Goleman's book or coaching.
Let's say that somebody scores initially lower on the EI scale. Is this something to be practiced?
So emotional intelligence can be both learned and practiced, with emotional intelligence being such a critical group of skills tied to success. This is not an area to learn about once. This is not a once and done. And so folks that really want to work in this area or build these skills need to practice it. Again, many clients will go through coaching in order to strengthen these. We can always work to build our emotional intelligence. So at any point in life, this can be an area for development. But having a data from the assessment, especially with coaching, reinforces the learning and helps build out these critical areas to success in both business and in life.
Okay, so how can a manager, if he or she wants to improve the overall intelligence of their team, what is that process like? How could they encourage other people on their team to take steps to improve their EI?
I think a great way for managers to help themselves and their team build EI is to partner with a coach or consultant to do a workshop to help them understand what are we even talking about when we begin development of emotional intelligence, having the members of the team go through an emotional intelligence assessment with a coaching debrief, but then have another workshop where the coach or facilitator meets with the leader in the team to help talking about what comes next. What are ways for them to practice? How can they support each other? How can the managers support their team in developing and building these competencies and skills?
Okay, that's great. Now, so we've got that on a team level from a manager perspective. What about on an individual level? We'll talk about it more on an organizational scale later, but on an individual level, how can someone improve their EI?
So emotional intelligence can be strengthened by recognizing and naming their own emotion, asking for feedback, and reading the literature to become more familiar with the research and the information about emotional intelligence. Being emotionally literate, getting fluid in the language of emotions, and what are we naming our emotions? But also keeping in mind that there are no bad emotions. The other way that I've found that really helps people is to write down how they're feeling throughout the day. And maybe they do that for a week or a few weeks where they're keeping track of what emotions are coming up. There's many times in the day where things may come up that are unplanned, or people may become stressful, or the leader may have a huge success with their team. And so sometimes simply just writing down the name of those feelings helps that person to become more aware of identifying what are these emotions that I'm currently experiencing.
That is fascinating that it is that simple, that truly just acknowledging what you're feeling and speaking what you're feeling, that alone can help develop EI.
Yep.
That's so interesting to me. So is that a component of maybe a lack of emotional intelligence, is a fear of one's own emotions?
Or a lack of awareness of
Yeah.
identifying those
Yes.
emotions. So if you remember, the first of the four behaviors for emotional intelligence is self-awareness.
That is so interesting. Okay. So if we're trying to improve the overall EI in our workplaces, we should also talk about using EI as a hiring metric. How can you measure a job candidate's emotional intelligence, in your opinion?
Great question. So, going back to Annie McKee, who's a best-selling author and on faculty at University of Pennsylvania, in 2016, she wrote a great article in Harvard Business Review, How to Hire for Emotional Intelligence. And she says very strongly, don't use an assessment, either a self-assessment or a 360. Instead, have deep conversations with the references. Ask very specific and pointed questions about how the candidate demonstrated various emotional intelligence competencies. Get lots of examples, lots of details, and specifically ask for examples of how the person treats other people. Also, take a look at how they can overcome obstacles. And you can use behavioral interviewing to get very specific. So, Annie McKee and all of her research has come back to say this is not an assessment, a self or a 360. It's dialogue with those who know and work with the potential candidate.
All right. So here's a wild card question. When it comes to hiring, which do you think is more important in a job candidate? And I kind of think I know what you're going to say, but just for the purpose of answering, I'll complete the question. Do you think it's more important to have a high IQ or a high EQ?
I think both are very important. We want to hire people that have a high level of intelligence and experience, or they wouldn't even be considered as a candidate for some of
Right.
our key openings. However, their ability to be effective, we have to take a look at social and emotional abilities because this enables and improves that cognitive learning. So this isn't an either or situation. It's recognized that these two types of intelligence need to work together.
Right. Okay. Well, Sarah, it's time now for a very quick break, and we'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and our guest today is Sarah Scala, founder and principal consultant of Sarah Scala Consulting. We are back. Earlier, we talked about ways to improve emotional intelligence on an individual scale. Now, let's talk about improving EI for a group of people, like a department, or even an entire workforce. Is that something that can be done on a broader scale?
It absolutely is. So, to create a culture of high emotional intelligence, leaders and managers have to model emotional intelligence behaviors. They have to set the norms for how things are communicated and also how the organization supports disagreement. They also can recognize and celebrate those who exhibit emotional intelligence, so making heroes out of those that help others. Sarah Scala Consultant provides organization and leadership development, executive coaching, change management, public speaking on emotional intelligence, and team development solutions, serving as a coach, consultant, and educator for US-based and global companies. So as a certified executive coach and authorized practitioner of many emotional intelligence tools and assessments, I provide a lot of coaching, teaching, and speaking. I teach emotional intelligence for Harvard at the Harvard Ed Portal. And there, as I mentioned earlier, are many assessments and also 360s that can be incorporated into coaching. And those include the Maslow-Sullivan-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test, the EQI 2.0 and EQI 360, which is a multi-rater assessment, and also the EQ 2.0 book and course. And so organizations can do everything by starting to have book groups if they're going to read some of these books to talk about the language of emotional intelligence, all the way to having team programs and executive coaching that incorporates the assessment data.
Wow. So there you heard it, guys. She does it all. If that wasn't clear. Are these in-person programs primarily, or are there virtual offerings as well? I would imagine, because we're actually recording this during COVID-19, that there are more virtual offerings, but please tell us about all of the above.
Happy to. So all of the above solutions are available both virtually and in person, whether it's assessments, coaching, courses, and presentations and public speaking engagements. I can do it both virtual or in person.
Okay, you said earlier that this isn't necessarily a one and done kind of thing. How often do you recommend that folks come to you for this kind of coaching?
So when I'm using emotional intelligence as an assessment, especially with leaders for their development, those leaders are typically enrolled in a coaching package with me from 3 to 12 months. And emotional intelligence is often one of the competencies or development areas that we're focusing on. Clients that simply want to focus on emotional intelligence, I typically will offer, much shorter coaching packages. For that, which can be seen on my website, sarahscala.com/EQ-1. And one and done is a nice intro, but if there's no follow-up resources or conversation, the retention is very low. So if we look at adult learning theory, I think we all know that if you go to a class or you sit in on a workshop or you read a book and nothing else happens, it's more of a nice to have than a development piece. So like building any skill, it needs to be practiced and people need to be reminded.
All right. Well, how can someone listening learn more about your company?
Thanks for asking. So the best place to start would be my website, www.sarahscala.com. And that's SARAHSCALA. And on this website, I don't only share about the services that I offer, but I also have a blog and I have a newsletter. In addition to the website, I have a YouTube channel with little clips of speaking engagement on emotional intelligence, neuro coaching, and positive psychology. I write for Medium, and those are some great places to learn more.
Wow, thank you so much. And just for those listening, links to Sarah's company will be included in this episode's companion guide as well. So don't forget to sign up for it at projectionsinc.com/podcast. But for now, Sarah, stay right where you are because our discussion isn't over yet. It's now time for our lightning round questions. And these are the questions we ask every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, topic showdown. In this episode, we discuss the topic of emotional intelligence. In your opinion, which of these fictional high IQ characters sports the higher EQ? Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory or Hermione Granger from Harry Potter?
I have to say Hermione because she's aware of the emotions of others. She supports friends, and she often uses magic to help the greater good.
I love that. What's the worst job interview question you've ever been asked?
Personally, I was asked an illegal question from a CEO who asked about members of my family. And I told the CEO it was illegal. I finished the interview and I declined to be considered for that opportunity because the CEO would have been my boss.
Wow. Okay. What is your favorite thing about working as a consultant?
I love connecting with diverse people and supporting improved performance and organization retention.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Ever since I was small, my dad, who's also an entrepreneur, would always say, keep working hard. Just keep working hard.
I love that. Who or what inspires you?
I am inspired by kindness, and I'm inspired by lifelong learning and increased opportunities to connect and learn virtually with people all over the world.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, Sarah.
This was wonderful. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Of course, it was so lovely to have you. And thanks also to our listeners. And don't forget to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. As always, we'd love for you to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. Remember, your ratings help more people to find us online, so thanks for the help. Well, that's it for me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.